Bitcoin. You've almost certainly heard the name. Maybe you've seen headlines about its price reaching new highs.
No.
Perhaps you've heard stories of people becoming millionaires after buying it early. Or maybe you've heard it's a scam, a bubble, or simply internet money with no real value. Few inventions in modern history have divided opinion quite like Bitcoin. To some people, it's the future of money, a financial revolution that removes the need for banks and governments to control how we transfer value. To others, it's nothing more than a highly speculative digital asset with no intrinsic value, a bubble waiting to burst. So who's right? Is Bitcoin one of the greatest technological breakthroughs of the 21st century, or one of the biggest financial misconceptions ever created? That's exactly what we're going to explore. Because whether you love Bitcoin, hate Bitcoin, or simply don't understand it, one thing is undeniable. It has changed the financial world forever. Since its creation in 2009, Bitcoin has grown from an obscure idea discussed on internet forums into an asset worth hundreds of billions of pounds. It's been adopted by companies, held by investment funds, accepted as legal tender by a country, and debated by governments, economists, bankers, and investors across the world. Yet despite all of that, most people still don't really know what Bitcoin actually is. Many think it's a company. It isn't. Others think it's controlled by one person. It isn't. Some believe it's anonymous. That's not entirely true either. And perhaps the biggest misconception of all, many people think Bitcoin is simply a digital version of money. In reality, it's something much more interesting than that. Bitcoin isn't just a digital coin. It's an entirely new way of recording ownership and transferring value without relying on a central authority. That single idea has challenged assumptions about money that have existed for centuries. But before we can decide whether Bitcoin deserves its reputation, we first need to understand how it works. Because unlike traditional money, Bitcoin wasn't created by a government, it wasn't issued by a central bank, and it wasn't launched by a company trying to make a profit. It began with a question: could money exist without needing anyone in charge? To answer that, we have to go back to 2008, a year that changed the global financial system forever. To understand Bitcoin, we first need to understand the world it was born into. In 2008, the global financial system suffered one of the worst crises in modern history. Banks that had existed for decades suddenly found themselves on the brink of collapse. Major financial institutions failed. Governments around the world announced enormous rescue packages. Millions of people lost their jobs. Families lost their homes. Confidence in the financial system was shaken. For many people, the crisis exposed a difficult reality. The institutions trusted to protect the world's money weren't as secure as everyone had believed. Questions began to emerge. If banks could fail, who was protecting ordinary people? If governments could create more money whenever they chose, what did that mean for the value of the money people had spent their entire lives earning? And perhaps the biggest question of all, did money really need a central authority at all? While economists, politicians, and central banks debated how to rebuild the financial system, someone else was thinking about a completely different solution. On the 31st of October 2008, a 9-page document quietly appeared on an online cryptography mailing list. It didn't make the news. There were no interviews, no product launch, no advertising campaign, just a simple title: Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The author signed it with a name the world had never heard before: Satoshi Nakamoto. To this day, nobody knows for certain who Satoshi Nakamoto really is. It could be one person, it could be a group of people. Despite countless investigations, books, documentaries, and theories, their true identity remains one of the greatest mysteries in modern technology. And strangely, that mystery may be one of Bitcoin's greatest strengths. Because there was no famous founder giving interviews, no CEO making decisions, no company controlling the project, the idea had to stand on its own. The white paper proposed something that many experts believed was impossible: a form of digital money that didn't require a bank, didn't require a payment company, didn't require anyone to sit in the middle approving transactions. Instead, the network itself would keep the records. The users themselves would verify the transactions, and mathematics, rather than trust, would enforce the rules. On the 3rd of January, 2009, Satoshi mined the very first Bitcoin block, known today as the Genesis block. Hidden inside that block was a message, a newspaper headline from that day's edition of the Times. The Times, 3rd of January, 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. People have debated the meaning of that message ever since. Some believe it was simply proof of the date the block was created. Others see it as a statement, a reminder of the financial system Bitcoin was designed to exist alongside, or perhaps even challenge. Whatever Satoshi intended, the timing was impossible to ignore. Bitcoin wasn't created during a period of economic confidence. It was born during one of the greatest financial crises in modern history. At first, almost nobody noticed. The software was open source, anyone could download it, anyone could read the code, anyone could join the network. There were no venture capital investors, no billion-pound marketing campaign, no promises of getting rich, just an idea, an experiment, one that asked a question many people had never considered before. What if money didn't need a bank? It was an extraordinary idea, but it also raised an obvious question. If there isn't a bank keeping track of who owns what, how can the system possibly work? That question is where the real innovation begins. By now, we know why Bitcoin was created, but one enormous question still remains. If there isn't a bank, who keeps track of everyone's money? Think about your own bank account for a moment. When you receive your salary, your bank updates its records. When you buy something, your bank updates its records again. If you transfer money to a friend, the bank checks you have enough funds, approves the payment, and updates both accounts. Everything depends on one central record, the bank's ledger. Bitcoin has no bank, no head office, no central computer, no employee checking whether your transaction is valid. So how can it possibly work? The answer is one of the most important innovations in modern computing. Instead of one central ledger, Bitcoin uses thousands of identical copies. Imagine a notebook. Every time someone sends Bitcoin, the transaction is written into that notebook. Now imagine, instead of one notebook sitting inside a bank, there are tens of thousands of identical notebooks spread across the world. Every person running the Bitcoin network has their own copy. Whenever a new transaction takes place, every copy is updated. Nobody owns the notebook. Everyone can read it. Nobody can secretly change it, because everyone else would immediately see the difference. That notebook is what we call the blockchain. Despite the complicated name, it's really just a list of transactions. Every few minutes, new transactions are grouped together. Those groups are called blocks. Once a block is verified, it's permanently linked to every block that came before it. One block linked to another, forming a chain, a blockchain. It's an incredibly simple idea, but it solves one of digital money's biggest problems. Imagine I send you one Bitcoin. What's stopping me from copying that transaction and sending the same Bitcoin to somebody else? After all, digital files can usually be copied infinitely. Photos, music, videos, documents. Why not digital money? This became known as the double spending problem. For decades, people believed the only solution was a trusted third party, usually a bank. Bitcoin proposed something different. Instead of asking one bank, the entire network checks every transaction together. If I only own one Bitcoin, the network knows I can't spend it twice. If I try, the transaction is rejected. Not because one company says so, but because thousands of independent computers all reach the same conclusion. That process is known as consensus. It's the network agreeing on one shared version of history. No single computer decides. No single government decides. No single company decides. The network decides. Of course, that creates another question. How do thousands of computers all over the world agree on the same answer without anyone being in charge? That's where Bitcoin introduces another revolutionary idea, mining. And despite what many people believe, Mining isn't really about creating Bitcoin. It's about protecting the network itself. By now, we understand what the blockchain is. A shared public ledger, copied across thousands of computers around the world. But another question immediately appears. If anyone can join the network, what stops somebody from cheating? What's stopping someone from creating fake transactions or rewriting the blockchain to steal Bitcoin they don't own? This is where mining comes in. Despite the name, mining isn't really about digging Bitcoin out of the internet. It's the process that protects the network. Think of it like a giant global competition. Around the world, specialized computers are constantly competing to solve an incredibly difficult mathematical puzzle. The first computer to solve it earns the right to add the next block of transactions to the blockchain. As a reward, it receives newly created Bitcoin, along with the transaction fees contained within that block. This system is known as proof of work. The name is actually very descriptive. The computer has to prove that it has performed a huge amount of computational work. That proof is incredibly difficult to produce, but remarkably easy for everyone else on the network to verify. So why go to all this effort? Because it makes attacking Bitcoin extraordinarily expensive. Imagine someone wanted to change a transaction that happened yesterday. Perhaps they wanted to erase a payment they made. To do that, they wouldn't just need to rewrite yesterday's block. They would need to remake every block that came after it, and they would have to do it faster than the rest of the entire Bitcoin network combined. At today's scale, that would require an enormous amount of computing power, enormous amounts of electricity, and billions of pounds worth of specialized hardware. Even then, there's no guarantee they would succeed. In most cases, it would simply be cheaper to buy Bitcoin than to try and attack the network. That's one of Bitcoin's most elegant ideas. Security doesn't come from trusting people. It comes from making dishonesty economically irrational. Honesty pays. Cheating is extraordinarily expensive. Of course, all of this computing power requires energy. And that's where one of Bitcoin's biggest criticisms begins. Critics argue that Bitcoin consumes too much electricity. Supporters respond that the energy secures one of the most valuable decentralized networks ever created. It's a debate that continues today, and one we'll return to later in this documentary. For now, the important thing to understand is this. Mining isn't just creating new Bitcoin. Its primary purpose is protecting the blockchain. The newly created Bitcoin is simply the incentive that encourages miners to spend enormous amounts of money securing the network. Without miners, there is no proof of work. Without proof of work, there is no consensus. And without consensus, there is no Bitcoin. But this raises another fascinating question. If anyone can mine Bitcoin, what stops someone from creating an unlimited supply? Why aren't there billions or even trillions of Bitcoin already in existence? The answer lies in one of the most important features ever written into computer code: scarcity. One of the most common criticisms of Bitcoin is surprisingly simple. It's not real. You can't hold it. It isn't backed by anything. So how can it possibly have value? They're fair questions. After all, if Bitcoin only exists digitally, why are people willing to pay thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of pounds, for a single coin? The answer begins with one word: scarcity. Think about gold for a moment. Gold has been valuable for thousands of years, not because it's the rarest metal on Earth, not because it's the most useful, but because it's difficult to find, difficult to extract, and impossible for anyone to create whenever they choose. Scarcity creates value. Bitcoin applies that same principle digitally. When Satoshi Nakamoto designed Bitcoin, they made one decision that would define the entire system. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, not approximately, not unless someone decides otherwise. Exactly 21 million. That limit is written into Bitcoin's code. Every computer running the network enforces it. If someone attempted to create a 21 million and first Bitcoin, the network would simply reject it because everyone else is following the same rules. That fixed supply makes Bitcoin fundamentally different from traditional currencies. Governments can increase the money supply. Central banks can introduce new money into the economy. That doesn't automatically mean they're doing something wrong. Sometimes expanding the money supply is seen as necessary during economic crises or to support the wider economy. But it does mean the supply can change. Bitcoin can't. Its monetary policy was decided from the very beginning, and changing it would require overwhelming agreement from the network itself. Another remarkable feature is that new Bitcoin becomes harder to create over time. Roughly every 4 years, the reward miners receive is cut in half. This event is known as the halving. In Bitcoin's early years, miners received 50 Bitcoin for every block they added, then 25, then 12 and a half, then 6.25. Today, the reward is even lower, and it will continue falling until eventually no new Bitcoin will be created at all. The final Bitcoin is expected to be mined sometime around the year 2140. From that point onwards, miners will earn their income primarily from transaction fees rather than newly created coins. It's an extraordinary design. Unlike traditional currencies, whose future supply depends on future decisions, Bitcoin's future supply has been known since the day it was created. Of course, scarcity alone doesn't create value. There are plenty of things that are scarce, but worthless. Value also depends on demand. And over the last 15 years, millions of people around the world have decided that Bitcoin is something worth owning. Some see it as digital gold, a long-term store of value. Others see it as protection against inflation. Some use it to transfer money across borders. Others simply see it as an investment. Different people, different reasons, and that growing demand, combined with a permanently limited supply, is one of the main reasons Bitcoin's price has risen so dramatically over time. But scarcity doesn't answer every criticism, because Bitcoin still faces difficult questions. Can something so volatile really function as money? Does it consume too much energy? Is it too slow for everyday payments? And perhaps most importantly, is Bitcoin really the financial revolution its supporters claim? Or are its critics right to remain skeptical? To answer that, we need to examine the strongest arguments from both sides. By now that we understand how Bitcoin works, why it was created, how the blockchain is secured, and why its supply is permanently limited. But none of that answers the biggest question of all. Is Bitcoin actually any good? For every person who believes Bitcoin is the future, there's someone else convinced it's destined to fail. Let's start with the arguments made by Bitcoin supporters. Many people describe Bitcoin as digital gold, not because it looks like gold, or because it's backed by gold, but because it shares many of gold's most important characteristics. It's scarce, difficult to produce, cannot simply be created whenever demand increases, and no single country controls it, unlike gold. However, Bitcoin can be transferred anywhere in the world in minutes. You don't need security vans, vaults, or border checks. You simply send it across the network. Supporters also argue that Bitcoin gives people something increasingly rare: financial sovereignty. If you hold your own private keys, your Bitcoin belongs to you. No bank can freeze it. No company can block a transaction. No government can create more of it. For people living in countries with stable economies, that might not seem particularly important. But for people experiencing hyperinflation, banking restrictions, or political instability, those properties can become incredibly valuable. Bitcoin has also become increasingly accepted by traditional finance. Public companies hold it on their balance sheets. Investment funds offer exposure to it. Some pension funds have begun exploring it. And in 2021, El Salvador became the first country in the world to recognize Bitcoin as legal tender. Whether that experiment proves successful over the long term remains a subject of debate, but it demonstrated something important. Bitcoin was no longer being discussed only on internet forums. It had entered mainstream finance. Of course, the supporters don't tell the whole story. Bitcoin has serious critics. One of the biggest criticisms is volatility. A currency that can gain or lose tens of percent in a matter of weeks is difficult to use for everyday spending. Imagine agreeing a salary today, only to discover it's worth 20% less next month, or 20% more. That uncertainty makes Bitcoin challenging to use as an everyday currency. Another criticism concerns energy consumption. As we discussed earlier, proof of work requires enormous computational power. Critics argue that this consumes too much electricity for a payment network. Supporters counter that much of the mining industry increasingly uses renewable or otherwise stranded energy, and that the energy cost is what secures the network against attack. The debate continues. Then there's scalability. Bitcoin deliberately prioritizes security and decentralization over processing huge numbers of transactions. That means it handles far fewer transactions per second than traditional payment networks. Supporters point to solutions such as the Lightning Network for faster, lower-cost payments. Critics argue that Bitcoin still faces challenges before it can compete with global payment systems at scale. Finally, there's regulation. Governments around the world continue trying to decide how cryptocurrencies should fit within existing financial laws. Some countries have embraced Bitcoin, others have imposed significant restrictions. Many are still deciding exactly how it should be regulated, and perhaps that's the most honest conclusion we can reach. Bitcoin isn't perfect. It never claimed to be. It's a technology with remarkable strengths and genuine weaknesses. Some people look at those strengths and see the future of money. Others look at the weaknesses and remain unconvinced. Neither side should ignore the other, because understanding both arguments is far more valuable than repeating slogans. After more than 15 years, Bitcoin still inspires passionate debate. Perhaps that debate itself tells us something important. Bitcoin isn't just another investment. It's an entirely different way of thinking about money. The only question that remains is whether history will remember it as a revolutionary breakthrough or simply the first chapter in a much larger story. Over the course of this documentary, we've explored one of the most fascinating inventions of the modern age. We've looked at why Bitcoin was created, how it works, why millions of people believe it could change the future of money, and why millions of others remain deeply skeptical. We've seen how one anonymous idea, published as a simple 9-page white paper, grew into a global financial network worth hundreds of billions of pounds. We've explored the technology behind the blockchain, the role of miners, the importance of scarcity, and the economic principles that give Bitcoin its value. We've also looked at the criticisms, its volatility, its energy consumption, its scalability challenges, and the uncertainty surrounding regulation. Because if we're going to understand Bitcoin, we have to understand both sides of the argument. So, is Bitcoin the king of digital money, or is it an imposter? The honest answer is, history hasn't decided yet. For some people, Bitcoin represents financial freedom, money that cannot be inflated away, money that can be owned directly, money that exists beyond the control of any single government or institution. For others, it's still too volatile, too speculative, too unpredictable to become the future of global finance. Perhaps both sides are right, at least for now, because Bitcoin is still incredibly young. Compared to gold, it's an infant. Compared to the banking system, it has existed for only a fraction of a second. The internet wasn't built in a decade. Neither was modern banking. Transformational technologies rarely reveal their full potential overnight. What makes Bitcoin remarkable isn't that it has answered every question. It's that it has forced the world to ask new ones. Who should control money? Can trust be replaced by mathematics? Can a decentralized network secure trillions of pounds in value? Can digital scarcity exist? 15 years ago, most people would have dismissed those questions entirely. Today, they're being discussed by governments, central banks, universities, investment firms, and technology companies around the world. Whatever happens next, Bitcoin has already achieved something extraordinary. It changed the conversation, and perhaps that's its greatest achievement. Not the price, not the headlines, not the fortunes that have been made or lost, but the fact that it challenged an idea most of us had never questioned: what money could be. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this documentary and you'd like to understand the world of cryptocurrency without the hype, consider subscribing, because Bitcoin was only the beginning. Its success inspired an entirely new generation of blockchain projects. Projects that asked a different question, What if a blockchain could do more than simply transfer money? What if it could run applications, execute agreements, and become a global computer? That idea would lead to the second largest cryptocurrency in the world, a project that changed blockchain forever. Its name was Ethereum.